Hi, my name is Butch Bailey. I'm an extension forester with Mississippi State University. And I'm here to talk to you today about one of the most frequently asked questions we get in the Extension Service. And it's also one of the most important, certainly one of the most impactful questions that landowners in the Southeast are faced with. And that is, are my pines ready to thin? Pines, of course, are the most commonly planted tree, crop tree, all over the Southeast. Mississippi is no exception. So it's safe to say that most forest landowners will be faced with this decision at least once, probably multiple times, many rotations as they own forest land. First of all, we need to talk about why we thin pines. And I've gotten this question quite a bit actually. Why should I thin pines? Won't the trees thin themselves? Well, certainly they will. But when they thin themselves, they're not going to do that in a manner that is beneficial to the landowner. It's a slow process. The growth for the entire stand slows down. They become very susceptible to insects and diseases. So we want to thin on our terms as a landowner to maximize whatever our objectives are. The first reason that we thin pines are so that we can, the first reason that we thin pines is so that the higher quality trees can grow. Not all trees are created equal. Some trees are genetically superior or inferior. Sometimes they may get a better start when they're young seedlings. And we want to maximize the growth on those superior individuals rather than continue growing and use that stand's growth potential on trees that are never going to make high quality products ever in the life of the stand. The second reason we thin pines is to receive some sort of intermediate income. Now, this is certainly not the overarching criteria. It's one of the things that many landowners do wrong, frankly. They put the economic impacts of that thinning ahead of the biological reasons. Getting that intermediate income before your final harvest is extremely important. It can help make financial sense, but it shouldn't be driving the process. We're going to talk about why that is. The third reason is to maintain stand health and vigor. If the trees are growing too tight, too densely, they're competing for sunlight, water, and soil nutrients, their growth slows and they become much more susceptible to insects and diseases. A number of insects and diseases. Most importantly, perhaps, is the southern pine beetle, which at times can reach epidemic status and destroy acres and acres of pine forest. The best method for preventing a southern pine beetle outbreak is keeping a pine stand well thinned. And the fourth reason that we encourage landowners to thin their pine trees is it enhances the stand for wildlife habitat. That can be game species, consumptive, non-consumptive, even just wildlife watching, birds, songbirds, you name it. There are 5 stand characteristics that we need to measure if we're going to make a scientific determination on whether or not a pine stand is ready to be thinned. The first is tree diameter. This is important for mainly financial reasons. Trees have to be a certain diameter before they're merchantable or before you can sell those trees for a profit. The second criteria that we need to measure is overall stand density. And stand density can be a confusing term. It takes into account both the number of trees per acre as well as the average size of those trees. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. The third thing we're going to measure is tree height. Total tree height is important more from an economic standpoint. And we'll talk about that. The fourth reason is the natural pruning height. That is the highest green limb, or the lowest green limb that's still on the tree. And the fifth and final is the growth rate. Tree diameter in most forestry practices is measured at what we call DBH, and that stands for diameter at breast height. That's a standard across the industry at 4.5 feet above the ground. So at 4.5 feet, we measure that and we call it DBH. For merchantable trees, for most parts of the Southeast and Mississippi, we want that tree to be at least 6 inches in diameter at DBH. Now that will vary from place to place, or I should say it will vary with market conditions from place to place, but that's a really good average that you need a tree to be at least 6 inches in diameter, 4.5 feet off the ground. The second criteria that we look at is stand density. Stand density, of course, is a measure of the number of trees per area as well as the size of the trees that we have per area. The best way to think about this is that any site, the soil on that site, can support a maximum volume of tree. And that same volume can be on a lot of little bitty small trees, or it can be on just a few really big trees. But if you cut all those trees down and measure it, it's going to be the same volume. Well, that's what we're trying to measure, is how much total tree there is on the site in general. And it's very important to remember, the goal of thinning is to reduce stand density by removing low quality trees and hopefully selling them to concentrate that stand's growth potential on the highest quality crop trees. In other words, at planting, a site may support 600 trees per acre, but as those trees grow, they each need more sun, more water, more nutrients. Eventually, the stand density, which is again trees per acre plus the size of those trees measured in dBH, increases above what the site can support. Growth will slow, susceptibility to southern pine beetle and other insects and diseases will increase, and suppressed trees, those trees that are smaller or shorter or less vigorous, will eventually die. Thinning takes the growth that would be wasted on those smaller trees that are going to die anyway, and we put that growth on those more superior crop trees. As you can see here, this thin weight diagram, it shows that this is a good average for the southeastern. Certainly it's a good average for Mississippi. Now every site's going to be slightly different, but you can measure there on one axis the trees per acre, and then across the bottom the average dBH of all the trees in that stand. And it's a simple matter of plotting out where your stand falls. If it falls below that line, you should probably wait to thin. If it falls above that line, you probably need to thin your stand. When we talk about measuring total tree height, this is one of those criteria that really matters more for economic reasons than for biological reasons. And it really boils down to transporting those logs from the woods to the mill. Trees that are at least 40 feet long can be most efficiently stacked on a log truck. Trees that are shorter than 40 feet often have to be double bunked, and you can't get as many tons of wood or tons of fiber on that truck. And so you get less, well, the logger will get less when he delivers those, which means the landowner gets less per load as well. The next criteria we need to discuss is the natural pruning height. Pine trees are very shade intolerant. That means they need a lot of sunlight to grow. And any limb on that tree that does not receive enough sunlight to support itself, the tree will naturally cut off the nutrient supply to that limb, and it will fall off and die. That's why you get pine trees with those nice clear trunks all the way up. And that's what we want to see when we're growing saw timber. We need that lowest live limb to be at least 18 feet off the ground we need that first live limb to be at least 18 feet off the ground. Jesus Christ. I'll start this slide over.
You good? You're fine.
The next criteria that we need to discuss is the natural pruning height of the trees in this timber stand. And this is a criteria that matters for biological and economic reasons. We need that first log in the future stand. When this tree makes saw timber, when you sell it for saw timber, you need that first lowest log to be nice and clear and free of limbs, or it won't make a very good saw timber log. In order to ensure this, you need to make sure that the lowest live limb at your first thinning is at least 18 feet off the ground. The reason for this is because pine trees are shade intolerant. If it has living limbs below that 18-foot threshold, once you thin the stand and more sunlight hits that lower limb than was before, well, the tree has no incentive to ever drop that limb. And it'll hold on, and it would degrade the quality of that saw timber log. However, if your lowest live limbs are above 18 feet off the ground, then there will be no limbs there even after sunlight hits the tree. The tree won't sprout new limbs below that point, and you'll have a nice saw timber log. The last criteria that we talk about in determining whether a pine stand needs to be thinned is growth rate. Just a matter of how well the trees are growing. This really can drive the whole decision on its own. The bottom line is, if the trees are growing well, if they're vigorous and healthy, and they're putting on a good measure of volume every year, you probably don't need to thin. But once that growth rate begins to slow down, that's when you know that the stand vigor is decreasing, stand health is decreasing, and you need to concentrate that growth that you're losing on better trees. Many people will target a percentage that may be their alternative investment percentage, prime interest rate, or if you know that you can get 4% return on some other investment and your trees are growing at less than 4%, well, why not cut those trees, take that money, and put it where it can grow at a more substantial rate? So to review our thin, no thin checklist, the first thing we measure is tree diameter. Are the trees at least 6 inches in dBH? The next is stand density. Do I need to, yeah, let me start that whole thing over. You got to chop mine up like crazy, aren't you?
That's all right.
To review, let's look at our thin, no thin checklist. The first criteria we looked at, tree diameter. Are the trees at least 6 inches in dBH? This is so that we have merchantable material that we can sell to a mill. The next is stand density. And again, this is measuring the total volume of tree on the entire stand. The third is total tree height. And this is important so that we get a maximum dollar figure when we sell those logs so they can be efficiently stacked on a log truck. The fourth criteria, natural pruning height. We need at least 18 feet of clear trunk or at least 18 feet of trunk with no living green limbs on it. And the last, maybe the most important, is growth rate. Are the trees growing well? A question I get in my office, maybe as much as any other question I ever get, is shouldn't I wait a little bit so I can get another $1 or $2 per ton? Or I get often, I sold trees 15, 20 years ago and I got $15 a ton for pulpwood. Today the man's only offering me $7 a ton. Why is he ripping me off? Shouldn't I wait until prices get higher? Maybe, but probably not. One thing we tell landowners is that the decision for your first thin should never be driven by economics. That decision should be based on biology. If the stand is ready to be thin because the growth rates have slowed, you should probably go ahead and thin. And we'll show you why in just a moment. When we talk about the economics of selling trees and when you should thin, you keep in mind that not all the products you sell are created equally. Pine pulpwood or pulpwood is generally the lowest value product you'll ever sell from your timber forest. You don't get a lot of money for it. It should be seen as more of an extra incentive, a lagniappe, if you will. Most people that grow trees, the reason they grow the trees is to sell saw timber and poles. Saw timber and poles are your highest quality product. You get more money for selling those than any other product. And that's really what we're aiming for. The goal of pine management is to get as much saw timber and poles from that stand as possible. And then in between those two, we have chip and saw. Chip and saw being that intermediate product where the tree is sold for some 2x4, some dimensional lumber, and then most of it is chipped up and sold as pulpwood. As you can see on the graph here, pine pulpwood, generally speaking, is one of the lower value products. The same with hardwood pulpwood. Chip and saw being an intermediate product, and then saw timber by far being the most valuable. This is why we want to concentrate as much of that growth as we can on trees that are eventually become saw timber. If the tree is never going to be a saw timber quality log, if all it will ever be is pulpwood, then we need to remove that tree as early as possible and concentrate that growth on saw timber quality trees. Here's an example. We took income projected from a 17-year-old pine plantation, basically the average stand in Mississippi. We used a computer growth and yield model called WinYield and calculated the future value of revenue as well as the present value of revenue. And we're looking at just revenue alone. We're not considering planning cost, site prep, timber stand improvement, and so forth. Just to back up and tell you future value and present value, these are terms basically so we make sure we're comparing apples to apples. Future value is estimated income in the future based on a set of assumptions, and the present value is a discounted rate. We take future dollars and convert them to their equivalent in today's dollars. Here's our example harvest schedule and the number of tons of the various products that we remove. If our first thinning is at age 17 in this typical Mississippi pine stand, we're only cutting pulpwood off the site. We're getting about 17 tons per acre. On our second thinning, you can see that we get another product class. We get some chip and saw, 5 tons per acre, and then we get 21 tons per acre of pulpwood. And then our final harvest at age 32, you can see that now we've got saw timber. This was the point of this plantation, was to produce saw timber, and we've got 46 tons per acre. In terms of financial return, you can also see that first thinning only accounted for 7.5% of the revenue you received off that timber stand. The second thinning was just about 11%. So by far, most of the money made over the entire life of this plantation occurred in the last thinning. The reason that's so important when you look at whether or not your pines are ready to thin is that every thinning decision should be made to maximize volume and return on that final harvest. The first two are really just there to set up that return at the end. In another example, we're going to look at a combination of the cost and the revenue. So we're going to take into account the site prep and planting fees. We're also going to look at the taxes and the management fees typically associated with pine management. We're going to look at revenue from 2 thinnings as well as a final harvest at age 35 and use the same program to grow the stand out. We're also going to look at what difference it makes if we have a 42% increase in pulpwood prices. The reason we're calculating the difference in that 42% increase in pulpwood price is it represents that common question that we get. Shouldn't I wait until I get another $1 or $2 per ton before I sell these trees? Well, what that 42% increase is going to mean in this example is about $2.50 per ton. We're going to show you what difference that extra $2.50 per ton on the first thinning actually makes across the life of that timber stand, that rotation. Basically, you can see that at $6 a ton, the total return on that timber stand was $618.15 per acre. An additional $2.50 per ton on pulpwood at the first thinning increases it only to $656.33 an acre. It's hardly worth it if by delaying for that extra $2.50 a ton, you're increasing the stand's susceptibility to insects and diseases. Once we've made the decision that it's time to thin our pine stand, there's a couple of things we need to look at determining how we need to have that stand thinned. Many people will just go through and do a simple row thinning, and many times that's perfectly appropriate. But I think it's better if you have a target in mind. Commonly in Mississippi, pine stands are thinned down to a basal area of anywhere from 60 to 80 square feet per acre. Maybe you want to target a removal of 1/3 to a half of the total volume of trees on the timber site, and you certainly want to do everything you can to remove the worst trees, trees that are forked or crooked, trees that are never going to make a pole or saw timber should be removed as soon as possible. Plantation pines can be thinned slightly differently than seeded pines or a natural regenerated site. Plantation pines being usually put out in relatively straight rows, it facilitates thinning much easier. Now, from a landowner's perspective, in an ideal world, if costs weren't a concern, you would want to have every tree that was going to be cut marked, and you would only remove 1/3 to a half of those trees, but it would be the worst trees, and it would only be the worst trees, so that you take out all the bad trees and you leave all the good trees. But in the real world, that would be very cost prohibitive. Now, from an operational standpoint, the opposite would be the case. The easiest way would be to go through and just take out every 3rd row, or every other row maybe, and just you would remove the exact volume of trees. However, if you remove every 3rd row, you're not only removing 1/3 of the poor trees, you're also removing 1/3 of your best trees. So a common compromise would be a 4th or a 5th row thinning with operator select between those rows, so that you're taking out every 4th row, but he's also taking out, the operator of the harvester is taking out the poorest trees between those rows. So again, you're concentrating that stand's growth potential on the best trees there. In a non-plantation setting, oftentimes they'll have to create rows. They'll go through with the harvester and they'll go in a straight line and just cut out and make artificial rows and then do the operator select in between. One word of caution, when you're removing a third to a half of the trees on a site, you're adding that much sunlight to the forest floor. That means that sunlight is going to be available not only for your target crop trees, but also for every bush and shrub and grass and forb that's growing below those. Now, from a wildlife standpoint, that can be a really good thing. It's going to increase that stand's value as wildlife habitat. However, if you have invasive species growing below those trees, you're also going to add growth to those species. And we see this quite often. Landowners think they don't have a problem with privet or Kogan grass because while that stand is dense above them, the populations of those invasive species are low and scattered and suppressed. But as soon as a thinning operation comes through and opens up all that sunlight, well, those populations of invasive species can really explode, and they can really cause a lot of problems, not only by stealing some of that growth from your crop trees, but then after that rotation is done and you clear cut that stand or you cut it in some manner and you want to reestablish the site, well, now you have to deal with a very well-established invasive species population when you're trying to put your seedlings in the ground. So in summary, why do we thin pines? We thin pines, number one, to maintain and increase the stand's health and vigor. Number two, we want to not waste that stand's growth potential on poor trees that will never make saw timber and poles. We want to maximize the growth on our best trees. Two, when do we thin? We thin when the stand is biologically ready for thinning. Again, we don't want to let economics drive the decision, especially for the first thinning. In the second thinning, the economics become a little more important. And of course, in that final harvest, economics are very important. But for that first thinning, the decision really should be based on biology. Do the trees need to be thinned in order to maintain a healthy growth rate? Third, what do we measure? How do we go out in our stand and determine whether or not the stand needs to be thinned? Number one, we measure DBH, diameter at breast height. Two, we're going to measure overall stand density. Three, we're going to look at total tree height. Four, the natural pruning height. And fifth, the growth rate of the trees in that stand. The last question is, how long should we wait for pulpwood prices to increase before making that decision for your first thinning? I hope you'll agree with me now that that decision should not be put off for economic reasons. That first thinning should take place for biological reasons. Thank you.